It's hard to imagine now, sailing across icy seas in a wooden ship, your only protection from the cold a few layers of wool and the hope of a good fire somewhere below deck. But that's exactly what medieval sailors faced. Long before fleece, thermals, or insulated boots, men braved freezing winds, damp decks, and endless storms on voyages that could last for months. So how did they do it? How did sailors stay warm on ships in the medieval era? Let's set sail back in time. No GPS, no engines, no central heating. Just the creak of timber, the slap of the waves, and a biting wind that could chill you straight to the bone. The first thing to understand is that a medieval ship was not a comfortable place. Whether it was a Viking longship, a merchant cog from northern Europe, or a war galley in the Mediterranean, warmth was always a challenge. The sea doesn't care about your comfort, and the cold was often relentless, especially for those who sailed the North Atlantic, the Baltic, or the North Sea. The decks were open to the air. There were no enclosed cabins for common sailors. Rain, snow, and sea spray soaked everything. At night, the wind cut through the planks like knives. If you fell asleep wet, you woke up colder, and yet these men somehow managed to endure. So what was their secret? It came down to a mix of clever clothing, small comforts, shared body heat, and a stubborn, almost unbelievable toughness. Let's start with what they wore. Wool was their best friend. Not the soft merino wool we have today, but coarse, thick wool from hardy sheep that thrived in cold climates. Wool was essential because it stayed warm even when wet, unlike linen or cotton. A sailor might wear several layers, a linen undershirt to absorb sweat, then a thick wool tunic or coat on top. In colder regions, they added cloaks, hooded capes, and mittens made of felted wool. Some wealthier sailors or officers might have had furs, sheepskin, fox, or rabbit, stitched into their clothing. But for most men, it was wool, leather, and prayer. And then there were the boots. Leather boots, often greased with animal fat or beeswax to keep out water, were tied tight around the calves. They weren't waterproof, but they helped. Sometimes sailors lined their boots with straw or moss for insulation, a natural kind of sock that trapped heat. It sounds crude, but it worked surprisingly well. In some cases, they even stuffed straw between layers of clothing. Imagine that, walking around with straw rustling inside your tunic, but staying just warm enough to survive another freezing night on deck. Now, warmth wasn't only about what they wore, it was also about how they lived aboard the ship. Most medieval vessels had little to no heating. Fire and wood don't mix well on a wooden ship, for obvious reasons. Still, sailors found ways to use fire safely. In larger ships, especially merchant cogs or exploration vessels, there might be a small brazier or clay stove, usually kept on a bed of sand or stones to reduce the fire risk. The heat was weak and local, but it was enough to warm hands or dry out a soaked shirt. Cooking fires were often allowed only in calm weather. When the seas were rough, they relied on cold food, hardtack biscuits, dried fish, salted meat. Nothing warms you less than cold salted pork in freezing wind, but it kept them alive. Some ships in northern waters carried portable braziers, small metal pans filled with hot coals from the last shore stop. Sailors would huddle around them in shifts, sharing that small pocket of warmth like it was gold. They couldn't risk too many fires at once, but even a few glowing embers could make a world of difference. When the nights turned cruel, sailors got creative. They learned to use the ship itself as shelter. On deck, they might build a makeshift tent using old sails or spare tarps, lashing them to the masts to block the wind. Beneath the deck, space was cramped, dark, and smelled of salt and sweat, but at least it was dry and the air was a bit warmer. They often slept side by side, shoulder to conserve heat. In a way, it was their version of central heating, human warmth shared under layers of rough blankets and cloaks. Some accounts even mention sailors wrapping themselves in wet sailcloth, not to stay dry, but to block the wind and trap a little body heat, and yet No matter how many tricks they used, the cold still got them. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion were common. A cold sailor was a slow sailor, and on deck, that could mean death. That's why movement was key. Sailors didn't just stand still, they worked constantly. Hauling ropes, climbing rigging, swabbing decks, adjusting sails. These weren't just chores, they were survival. Physical labor kept their blood moving, kept them warm, and reminded them that they were still alive. And when they could, they drank. Ale, mead, and even watered-down wine were a daily part of life at sea. Not only because clean water was rare, but because alcohol made them feel warm. It didn't truly raise their body temperature, but it gave a momentary sense of comfort. You can imagine them, passing a flask around, laughing through chattering teeth, pretending the warmth in their bellies was stronger than the storm around them. Now it's worth noting that not all seas were equally cruel. In the Mediterranean, sailors had a different relationship with cold. The winters were milder, but the nights at sea could still be bitter, especially when damp winds blew from the north. There, clothing was lighter. Linen shirts, wool cloaks, sometimes fur-lined collars. But even in southern waters, the sea had its own chill. Once the sun set, heat vanished fast. Viking sailors, on the other hand, took cold endurance to a whole new level. Their longships were open from bow to stern, no cabins, no shelter, nothing but the sky. They relied heavily on furs, layered wool, and constant rowing to stay warm. Archaeological finds from Viking graves show garments like thick tunics, wool leggings, and heavy cloaks pinned with brooches. Some of their ships carried tarred leather coverings or wooden awnings that could be set up over sleeping areas, a small barrier against sleet and snow. And the Vikings had one more advantage: mindset. To them, hardship was expected. The sea was a test, not a comfort. They grew up in cold climates, used to sleeping in drafty halls or under open skies. Enduring cold was part of their identity. It proved strength. That mental toughness may have been their greatest warmth of all. But here's something people often forget. Medieval sailors didn't always sail through winter. Many ports shut down navigation during the coldest months. Ice, storms, and unpredictable winds made winter voyages deadly. When possible, crews waited for spring or summer to set sail. Of course, wars, trade, or exploration didn't always allow such luxury, but timing mattered. Still, no matter the season, the ocean always had a way of surprising them. Even in summer, cold gales could strike without warning. A sailor could go from sweating under the sun to shivering in soaked clothes within minutes. And there was no easy way to dry anything. Imagine trying to dry a wool cloak in the middle of a storm, with seawater crashing over the deck. Once your clothes got wet, they stayed wet for days. Some sailors hung garments near the galley fires, turning them every hour. Others simply kept wearing the same damp clothes until they dried from body heat, or didn't. Despite all that, there was something binding about that shared misery. Warmth wasn't just physical, it was social. The bond between shipmates was forged in that cold, in those sleepless nights when you huddled together under a tarp, sharing stories, food, and laughter. The camaraderie itself was a kind of fire. It's easy to romanticize now, the idea of brave sailors beneath starry skies, steering by the constellations. But for them, it was survival. Every gust of wind, every icy wave, was a challenge to endure. And somehow, through a mix of resilience, resourcefulness, and pure human stubbornness, they did. One more thing, the cold also shaped their culture. Songs, superstitions, and daily rituals all helped sailors cope. Before long voyages, crews might rub grease or animal fat into their skin, believing it would keep out the chill. They'd tell stories about sea spirits that froze careless men who mocked the ocean. And when the cold felt unbearable, they'd sing. Singing kept rhythm while rowing, but it also lifted spirits and created a sense of warmth through unity. Think about it. Your breath visible in the air, your fingers numb, but your voice strong, echoing across the waves. That sound, that connection, was its own kind of heat. By the late medieval period, ships had improved. Some larger vessels began to feature small cabins or forecastles at the front for officers. These might have thick curtains, straw bedding, even a tiny brazier. But for the common sailor, conditions changed little. Warmth still